There comes a moment, often quietly and without ceremony, when you notice something unsettling. You no longer feel the same urgency to be liked. The old reflex to explain yourself, to soften your truth, to adjust your tone so others feel comfortable around you, it weakens. And at first, this feels like relief. A great weight lifts. You feel honest, unfiltered, strangely calm. But soon after, something else arrives. A loneliness unlike any you've known before. Alan Watts often spoke about how much of human behavior is driven by the need for approval, not because we consciously choose it, but because the ego is built from it. From childhood onward, we learn who we are by watching how others respond to us. Praise shapes identity. Rejection wounds it. Over time, we become performers in a silent play, constantly adjusting our mask to maintain belonging. And we call this connection. But when awakening begins, whether through suffering, insight, or simple exhaustion with pretending, this performance starts to fall apart. According to Alan Watts, the moment you stop asking, "How do they see me?" something fundamental shifts. The ego loses one of its main fuel sources. And when that fuel disappears, the familiar warmth of social reassurance goes with it. This is why the loneliness feels so strange. It's not the loneliness of being rejected. It's the loneliness of no longer needing to be accepted. People may still be around you. Conversations may still happen. But something invisible has changed. You're no longer leaning toward others for confirmation that you exist, that you matter, that you're doing life correctly. And without that leaning, a quiet distance opens. Alan Watts explained that most relationships are unconscious agreements. I'll help you feel real if you help me feel real. Approval becomes the currency. Compliments, validation, recognition, these are not just pleasant extras. They are the glue. When you stop trading in that currency, the structure itself loosens. And suddenly, you're standing alone, not because others left, but because you stopped reaching. At first, the mind interprets this as something going wrong. It whispers, you're becoming detached, cold, isolated. But Watts would remind us that this is not detachment from people. It's detachment from illusion. You're no longer using others as mirrors to reassure a fragile sense of self. And without those mirrors, the room feels empty. This is the beginning of the strange loneliness. Not the ache of abandonment, but the silence that follows authenticity. You are no longer curating yourself for applause. You are simply here. And while this honesty brings freedom, it also removes the familiar noise that once distracted you from yourself. This loneliness is not a failure of awakening. It is its early echo. Alan Watts once pointed out that the ego is not something you possess, but something you perform. It's a pattern of behavior, a role maintained through feedback. And approval is the applause that keeps the performance alive. When you stop seeking it, the stage lights dim. The audience fades. And for the first time, you're left alone with something unfamiliar. Yourself without a script. This is why the loneliness after awakening feels different from ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness wants company. It aches for contact, reassurance, warmth. But this new loneliness doesn't quite want anyone. You may find that being around people doesn't relieve it, and yet being alone doesn't worsen it either. It simply exists, quietly, like an open space where something used to be. According to Alan Watts, this space appears when identification loosens. You're no longer constantly referencing yourself against others. You're not measuring your worth by reactions, likes, approval, or agreement. And while this brings clarity, it also removes the constant emotional stimulation that once made life feel populated. Much of what we call connection, Watts suggested, is actually mutual stimulation of identity. When that stops, the emotional buzz disappears. You might notice conversations becoming thinner, not because people have less to say, but because you're no longer feeding the invisible game beneath the words. You're not subtly seeking confirmation, nor are you offering it as readily. You listen more. You speak more honestly. And this changes the entire emotional rhythm of interaction. Many people feel this shift, even if they can't name it. And so the loneliness deepens not in pain but in clarity. You realize how much of your previous closeness was built on shared insecurity, shared self-image, shared masks. When those masks fall, there is less to cling to. What remains is simple presence. And presence, at first, can feel stark. Alan Watts warned that when illusions fall away, the mind often labels the result as emptiness. But emptiness is only frightening when we expect it to be filled. You're so accustomed to the noise of validation that its absence feels like loss. But what's actually gone is the constant echo of yourself coming back through others. This is why approval seeking is so seductive. It creates a sense of solidity. I am seen, therefore I exist. When that equation dissolves, existence becomes quieter, less defined, less dramatic. And in that quiet, the ego panics. It says, you're disappearing. You're becoming no one. But Watts would smile at this. He often said that becoming no one is not annihilation, it's liberation. The loneliness you feel is not because you are unloved. It's because you're no longer using love as proof of identity. You're beginning to exist without a constant reflection. This stage is uncomfortable because it strips away emotional crutches. There's no crowd to lean into, no familiar validation loop to soothe you. But there is something else beginning to form a relationship with yourself that does not depend on being witnessed. This loneliness is not asking to be fixed. It's asking to be understood. Alan Watts often emphasized that the deepest transformations do not announce themselves with fireworks. They arrive quietly, disguised as discomfort. And this loneliness you're experiencing after you stop seeking approval is one of those disguises. It feels like something has gone missing, but in truth something unnecessary has fallen away. What's left feels unfamiliar because you were never taught how to be with it. For most of your life, approval acted like a kind of social gravity. It pulled you into conversations, into roles, into expectations. You laughed at certain jokes, agreed at certain moments, withheld certain truths, not because you were dishonest, but because belonging required a constant adjustment of self. Alan Watts described this as playing the game of being somebody. And like all games, it only works if others agree to play along. When you stop seeking approval, you stop adjusting yourself to the room. You no longer bend your inner truth to maintain emotional comfort. And this changes something subtle but profound. You stop orbiting other people's expectations. Without that orbit, there is space. Wide, silent space. And space can feel like isolation when you're not used to standing on your own center. This is why the loneliness doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't ache or beg. It simply reveals how much of your former social life was built on mutual reassurance rather than genuine resonance. You begin to notice that many interactions were not about sharing presence, but about exchanging validation. Do you see me? Yes, I see you. Over and over again. Alan Watts pointed out that when this exchange stops, relationships often thin out naturally. Not because something went wrong, but because their foundation was never presence, it was identity maintenance. And when you're no longer interested in maintaining an image, those connections quietly dissolve. You may start to feel invisible, not ignored, but unseen in a new way. People don't respond to you as they used to. Your silence isn't rewarded. Your honesty isn't always welcomed. And for the ego, this feels like rejection. But it's not rejection, it's neutrality. The world is no longer constantly mirroring you back to yourself. This can be deeply unsettling because approval once gave structure to your emotional life. It told you who you were, where you stood, how you were doing. Without it, there is no scoreboard, no feedback loop, just raw experience. Watts explained that this stage often feels like standing alone in a vast field with no signposts. You're not lost, but you're also not being guided. And the mind doesn't like this. The mind wants direction, affirmation, certainty. But awakening is not about certainty. It's about intimacy with uncertainty. The loneliness you feel is the mind discovering that it cannot lean outward anymore. It must rest inward. And at first, that inward resting feels empty because you've never truly inhabited yourself without commentary, without judgment, without comparison. This is not a failure of connection. It is the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one that doesn't require approval to exist. Alan Watts often reminded his listeners that the feeling of being separate is largely an illusion created by thought. Yet paradoxically, when that illusion begins to dissolve, the first thing many people feel is not unity, but aloneness. This is because the mind loses the familiar reference points it once used to feel connected. Approval, agreement, recognition. These were the bridges. When they fall away, you're left standing without crossings. This is why the loneliness after you stop seeking approval can feel so stark. It isn't that you've been abandoned. It's that the old ways of relating no longer function. You're no longer meeting people through the filter of who you think you should be. You're not presenting a curated self. And without that performance, many interactions simply don't know where to land. Watts would say that society trains us to be performers long before it teaches us to be present. From childhood, we learn that being liked equals being safe. Approval becomes a survival strategy. And so when you stop seeking it, the nervous system reacts as if something dangerous is happening. It interprets neutrality as threat, silence as rejection, solitude as failure. But this reaction is conditioned. It's not truth. It's habit. As you sit in this strange loneliness, you may notice something unexpected. You are less reactive. You're not scanning faces for cues. You're not adjusting your words to secure warmth. You're simply here. And while this feels emotionally quieter, it is also more honest. There's no effort involved in being what you are. Alan Watts described this as the difference between being tune and trying to be in tune. When you're no longer trying to manage how you're perceived, there is a natural alignment that emerges. But at first, this alignment doesn't feel pleasurable. It feels bare. This is because approval once acted as emotional insulation. It softened the edges of experience. Without it, life feels more direct. Sounds are sharper. Silences are longer. And you begin to feel the full weight of your own presence. You may find yourself withdrawing, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Small talk loses its appeal. Performative connection feels exhausting. And you may worry that something is wrong with you, that you've become cold, distant, or disconnected. Watts would gently challenge that assumption. He often said that true connection is not noisy. It doesn't demand constant exchange. It arises naturally when two people are present without pretense, and presence cannot be forced. This loneliness is the space in which pretense has dissolved. It's the quiet after you stop pretending to be someone for someone else. And while the ego interprets this as loss, something deeper recognizes it as relief. You are no longer crowded by expectations. You are no longer carrying the emotional weight of being agreeable, impressive, or acceptable. What remains may feel like emptiness, but it's actually spaciousness. And in spaciousness, something new begins to breathe. This spaciousness that follows the cessation of approval seeking is both liberating and disorienting. Alan Watts often described it as stepping off a moving walkway and suddenly feeling the ground beneath your own feet. The constant propulsion of social expectation stops, and you are forced to balance yourself without external momentum. For many, this feels like instability, even vertigo, because the self has been so long constructed around reflection from others. In this quiet, you may start noticing subtle shifts. Old fears begin to dissolve. not because they are confronted directly, but because the scaffolding that supported them is removed. Fear of judgment, fear of exclusion, fear of not being enough. All these lose their power when you no longer measure yourself against other eyes. Watts emphasized that the ego is largely a social construct, maintained through comparison. Remove the constant feed of others' perceptions, and the ego begins to dissolve naturally. Yet the loneliness persists, because human nature has long confused connection with validation. We feel seen, we feel secure, and we confuse that with existence itself. But in this new state, you may realize that true presence does not require being seen at all. You are not lonely in the sense of absence. You are solitary in the sense of completeness. This is a subtle, almost paradoxical distinction. Loneliness becomes the doorway to wholeness. Some days, this feels uncomfortable, even frightening. You may catch yourself longing for the old days, for the warmth of approval, for the reassurance of being liked. But Watts would point out that this longing is merely the mind clinging to old patterns. It is habit, not necessity. The deeper intelligence within you recognizes that dependency on external validation is no longer required. And that is where fear often lingers, the fear of facing yourself without the buffer of applause. What you may not expect is how relationships begin to change. People who thrived on your approval may feel challenged. They may misunderstand your calm neutrality as coldness or detachment, but this is a necessary adjustment. Watts often noted that awakening does not conform to expectations. As you stop seeking approval, you align more authentically with your inner rhythm, and life begins to reflect that alignment. Those who resonate with your presence remain. Those who require performance drift away. And here is the crucial insight. The loneliness is not a punishment. It is the silent teacher, the mirror showing you that your existence does not need validation to be real. Watts described this as the quiet liberation of being. It is subtle, almost invisible, but it is profound. You are learning to inhabit yourself fully, without scaffolding, without props, without an audience. The strange loneliness is a signpost. It indicates that you are leaving the realm of dependence on external approval. You are stepping into an inner territory where your being is sufficient unto itself. And in that sufficiency, life begins to taste different, not empty, but deep, expansive, and unconditioned by expectation. In this new state, you may notice that time itself begins to feel different. The rush to impress, the compulsive need to respond, the endless rehearsals of social performance, all of that begins to slow. Alan Watts often described life not as a series of objectives to be achieved, but as a dance, a river, a flowing pattern of presence. When you stop seeking approval, you stop trying to control how others perceive you, and suddenly you can move more fluidly through life. Your energy is no longer divided between being yourself and being acceptable. It is concentrated fully on simply being. This is why many people report a sense of strange freedom after letting go of approval. But freedom in this sense is different from the excitement or indulgence we often associate with pleasure. It is subtler, quieter, almost invisible to those still attached to recognition. Watts would say that it is like the stillness at the center of a storm. There is nothing missing, nothing lacking, and nothing to attain. Yet it can feel lonely, because the old measures of significance, praise, admiration, inclusion no longer apply. You might notice that ordinary social interactions feel less compelling. Gossip, comparison, approval-seeking, they all lose their pull. This is not cynicism. It is clarity. Alan Watts explained that the awakened mind sees the illusions underlying social structures, and with that perception comes a natural detachment. You are not forced to play the game anymore, and yet you may feel strangely isolated because most people are still deeply engaged in it. The mind may rebel. You may think, am I becoming cold? Detached? Broken? This is the usual fear. Watts often emphasized that fear is simply a signal from the conditioned ego that the familiar patterns are dissolving. And yet, these fears are not reality. They are echoes of old survival mechanisms. The quiet that follows approval seeking is not a loss, but the emergence of a different kind of presence. One that does not rely on mirrors, on applause, or on external validation. Interestingly, this stage brings a certain emotional independence. You may find yourself less affected by criticism or praise, more grounded in your own rhythm. Relationships may shift naturally. Those who need you to perform for them may drift away. Those who resonate with your authentic presence remain. Watts would remind us that this is the natural sorting mechanism of life. The ego-based connections fall away, leaving space for genuine resonance. And in that space, in that quiet, subtle solitude, a new kind of intimacy begins with yourself. You start noticing the depth of your own presence, the patterns of your thoughts, the richness of your awareness, without needing an external lens to define it. The loneliness you feel is no longer painful. It is the silence in which the self begins to truly live. This is the profound paradox Alan Watts pointed to. In letting go of the need to be seen, you finally see yourself. And that seeing is liberation. As this process unfolds, you may also notice subtle shifts in your emotional landscape. Alan Watts often highlighted that emotions are not inherently good or bad. They are signals, reflections of your engagement with life. When approval is no longer a driving force, many old anxieties, insecurities, and compulsions begin to soften. You stop performing for others, and the tension that came with that performance slowly dissolves. What remains is a calmer, more measured emotional state, though it may feel strange at first. The loneliness that arises here is different from ordinary loneliness. It is not a gnawing emptiness that demands filling, nor is it a yearning for distraction. It is the quiet echo of your true present space without external embellishment. Watts would describe it as a necessary pause, a stillness between the currents of conditioned behavior. In that stillness, you begin to meet yourself in ways you never have before. You may confront aspects of your character, fears, or desires that were previously muted by the constant noise of social affirmation. Many people resist this stage, mistaking it for failure or isolation. They may attempt to fill the space with old habits, seeking attention, validation, or reassurance from others. But the key insight Watts offered is that these attempts only recreate the cycle you are meant to transcend. The strange loneliness, paradoxically, is the container for growth. It is a signal that you are no longer dependent on external recognition, and that your life is beginning to align with a deeper, more authentic rhythm. You may also notice a profound change in how you perceive relationships. Watts often noted that once someone stops seeking approval, they stop being manipulated by others' expectations, and this is both liberating and disorienting. People may react with confusion or resistance. Some friendships or connections may fade, not out of malice, but because the previous dynamic was based on roles and expectations rather than genuine resonance. Those who remain are drawn by authenticity, not performance. Importantly, this stage invites a re-evaluation of purpose. When you are no longer motivated by the need to be liked or admired, your actions arise more naturally, more spontaneously, and from a deeper alignment with your own values and awareness. Watts described this as the shift from living in reaction to living in harmony with the flow of existence itself. In this flow, the loneliness is no longer absence, it is presence. And here lies the ultimate paradox. The more you accept the solitude that follows the cessation of approval seeking, the more connected you become to yourself, to life, and to the subtle patterns that were always there, but masked by the need for external validation. Watts would remind us that true freedom is found not in others' acknowledgement, but in the quiet recognition of your own being. The strange loneliness is, therefore, a doorway, not a punishment, not a void, but an invitation to inhabit yourself fully, to become whole, and to see life through eyes unclouded by expectation. As you move through this stage, you may begin to notice an extraordinary shift in your perception of life itself. Alan Watts often spoke of awakening as not a dramatic event, but a subtle unveiling, an opening of awareness that reveals what was always present but overlooked. When the need for approval dissolves, you start experiencing life without the constant filter of judgment and expectation. Colors may feel sharper, sounds more vivid, moments more profound, and yet, this richness arrives quietly. It does not scream for attention, it simply is. The loneliness you encounter now is not emptiness. It is space for presence. Watts compared this to a musical rest. The pause between notes is what gives the melody its shape. In your life, the absence of constant validation allows your being to resonate on its own frequency. You are no longer a reflection of others' expectations. You are the source of your own experience. And paradoxically, in inhabiting yourself fully, you become more available, more real to others. This stage may also illuminate the impermanence of attachment to outcomes. You may notice that praise, recognition, or even love no longer hold the same gravitational pull over your mind. Watts would say that this is not detachment in the sense of coldness, but a liberation from the compulsive need to measure worth externally. You act, you create, you relate not to be approved of, but because it aligns with your deeper rhythm. Actions lose their anxious weight and take on a clarity and freedom that was impossible when driven by approval. At times, the loneliness may feel daunting. You may question whether connection is possible without the familiar scaffolding of social approval. But the truth is, the connections you now form are more profound precisely because they are voluntary, authentic, and rooted in presence rather than performance. Watts often noted that such relationships are rarer, but infinitely richer. They are less frequent, perhaps, but they resonate deeply. Ultimately, the strange loneliness is not a destination. It is a passage. It is the terrain you must traverse to inhabit yourself fully, to encounter life directly, and to discover that your worth, your presence, your being, is inherent and complete. Watts reminds us that the world outside is never a reliable mirror of who we are. True alignment, true peace, and true presence come from within, and only when the need for external validation has faded can you experience it fully. So embrace the quiet, embrace the solitude, embrace the strange in-between. You are neither lost nor abandoned. You are simply stepping into a new way of being, one where the echoes of approval no longer dictate your life. In that space, you begin to see clearly, to feel fully, and to be free in a way that was impossible while seeking permission to exist. This is the profound gift of ceasing the pursuit of approval. The strange loneliness reveals itself not as a void, but as the very doorway to inner wholeness, authenticity, and liberation.